Paul is 50. 3 months ago, the company he'd worked for eliminated his entire department. And, strangely enough, that severance letter accomplished something years of performance reviews never did. It forced him to stop avoiding the numbers. He figured he had about 14 years left before retirement. Plenty of time? Or so he'd always told himself. But when he finally added everything up, the result wasn't just disappointing. It was nowhere near the number he'd convinced himself he had. And that's the fear behind this entire video. Not that dividend investing doesn't work. It's the feeling that maybe you waited too long, and now there isn't enough time left for it to make a real difference. What nobody explained to Paul during that meeting is that the tax code actually gives people his age advantages that someone in their 30s simply isn't allowed to use. Real advantages, thousands of dollars in extra contribution room, tax rules that can save you money if you know they exist, and one retirement strategy that can potentially give you access to income years earlier than most people realize. So this isn't another "it's never too late" motivational speech. We're going to look at the actual rules, the ones that determine how much you can contribute, how your dividends get taxed, and how you can build income before the age most people assume retirement even begins. There are really 3 things that determine whether starting at 50 can still work. First, how much the IRS actually lets you contribute each year, and one common misunderstanding that causes a lot of people to overestimate what's available. Second, a little-known 61-day rule that determines whether your dividends receive favorable tax treatment or get taxed like ordinary income. And third, a strategy that can help bridge the years before age 59 and a half, allowing you to access retirement money earlier than many people think is possible. By the end of this video, you won't just understand Paul's situation, you'll be able to calculate your own. So before we dive into the details, what do you actually need to know? You need an account strategy that takes full advantage of every catch-up contribution available once you turn 50. Because that's one of the few financial benefits that actually improves with age. You also need to understand one holding period rule that quietly affects the taxes you pay on every dividend you receive. And finally, you need a realistic plan for the years before age 59 and a half, because that's where many late starters begin to panic and end up making expensive decisions. The good news is that none of this requires finding the next hot stock or perfectly timing the market. It simply comes down to understanding a handful of rules that have been sitting in the tax code all along. Rules that most people your age never use because no one ever explained them clearly. So let's start with the one that can immediately put more money to work before you even open your brokerage account. Let's call this the catch-up stack. If you're 50 or older in 2026, the IRS gives you something younger investors simply don't get. On top of the standard $24,500 contribution limit for a 401k, 403b, or similar workplace retirement plan, you're allowed to contribute another $8,000 as a catch-up contribution. That brings your total annual limit to $32,500. Your IRA gives you extra room too. Once you turn 50, you can contribute an additional $1,100 there as well. When you put it all together, someone who's 50 or older can invest $9,100 more every year into tax-advantaged retirement accounts than someone who's still under 50, all without opening any special accounts or using complicated strategies. Now here's where a lot of people get tripped up. If you're between 60 and 63, the IRS allows an even larger catch-up contribution in 2026, $11,250. Most people hear that and assume it's added on top of the regular $8,000 catch-up. It isn't. The larger amount replaces the standard catch-up. It doesn't stack with it, so your catch-up contribution is either $8,000 or $11,250 depending on your age. Never both. It may sound like a small detail, but building your retirement plan around money you can't actually contribute can leave you thousands of dollars short over just a few years. There's one more rule worth knowing, especially if you're a higher earner. Starting in 2026, if you earned roughly $150,000 or more in wages from a particular employer during the previous year, any catch-up contributions you make through that employer generally have to go into a Roth account instead of a traditional pre-tax account. One important detail, though, that income threshold applies separately to each employer. So if you change jobs recently, the wages you earned at your previous company don't count toward your current employer's limit. And if this is your first year with a new employer, you're generally not affected until the following year. Knowing these rules can put thousands of extra dollars to work every year. But there's another piece of the puzzle that matters just as much, because it doesn't matter how much you invest if the income it generates gets taxed more than it needs to. That's where the next rule comes in. And it's one that catches countless first-time dividend investors without them ever realizing it. Let's call it the 61-day tripwire. Most people assume all dividends are taxed the same way. They're not. Whether you pay the lower qualified dividend tax rate or your regular income tax rate can come down to one simple rule. And a surprising number of new investors break it without realizing they ever did. I like to call it The 61-day tripwire. Here's how it works. To qualify for the lower dividend tax rates, typically 0%, 15%, or 20%, depending on your income, you generally have to hold the stock for more than 60 days during a specific 121-day window centered around its ex-dividend date. If you don't meet that holding requirement, the dividend doesn't disappear. You still receive the payment, but instead of being taxed at the lower qualified dividend rate, it's usually taxed as ordinary income. And if you're starting at 50 and already earning a solid household income, that difference can be significant. A dividend that could have been taxed at 15% might instead be taxed at more than double that rate. Here's where people accidentally get themselves into trouble. Imagine you buy a dividend stock the day before its ex-dividend date because you want to collect the upcoming payment. A week later, the stock drops a little. You get nervous, or maybe another investment catches your attention. So you sell. Technically, you receive the dividend, but because you didn't hold the shares long enough, you may lose the qualified tax treatment entirely. The IRS isn't trying to punish you for selling, it's simply rewarding investors who actually hold their investments instead of jumping in and out to capture dividend payments, which if you're building a dividend income portfolio is exactly what you should be doing anyway. The good news is that the solution couldn't be much simpler. Buy companies, or ETFs, that you expect to own for months or years, not just until the next dividend arrives. If that's already your mindset, this rule mostly takes care of itself. It only becomes a problem when people treat dividend investing like short-term trading instead of a long-term income strategy. Now, contributing more each year matters. Keeping your taxes low matters too. But if you're starting at 50, there's another question that naturally comes up. What happens if you need access to your retirement money before age 59 and a half? Because that's when most retirement accounts still charge an early withdrawal penalty. Fortunately, there's a rule that many people have never even heard of. And for someone in Paul's situation, it can completely change how those early retirement years look. Let's call it the Rule of 55 Bridge. And if you're in Paul's position, it's one of the most valuable retirement rules you've probably never heard of. Here's how it works. If you leave your job, whether you retire, get laid off, or simply resign, in or after the calendar year you turn 55, you can withdraw money from that employer's 401k or 403b without paying the usual 10% early withdrawal penalty. You'll still owe ordinary income taxes on those withdrawals, but the penalty that normally applies before age 59 and a half is waived. For many people, that's the difference between having access to their retirement savings and feeling like they're locked out of their own money. But there's an important catch. This rule is much narrower than most people realize. It only applies to the retirement plan connected to the employer you just left. It doesn't apply to an old 401k from a previous job. It doesn't apply to your spouse's retirement account, and it doesn't apply to an IRA. In fact, here's the mistake that catches a lot of people. After leaving a job, many investors immediately roll their 401k into an IRA because it offers more investment choices. On the surface, that seems like the smart move, but once that money is rolled into an IRA, you permanently lose access to the Rule of 55 for those funds. There's no way to undo it later. Timing matters too. The rule is based on the calendar year you separate from your employer, not the exact day you celebrate your birthday. So if you leave your job at 54 and don't turn 55 until the following calendar year, you don't qualify, even if your birthday is only weeks away. For someone like Paul, who was laid off at 50 and still has years before traditional retirement age, this changes the conversation completely. Instead of seeing a job loss as a financial disaster, he can start planning ahead. If he returns to work and later leaves another employer after reaching 55, he can intentionally build a bridge that gives him penalty-free access to retirement savings years earlier than most people think is possible. And that bridge becomes even more powerful when you pair it with one more retirement decision that almost everyone treats separately, even though they really shouldn't. Let's call it the claiming age trap. Because one of the biggest retirement decisions you'll ever make isn't just how much you save. It's when you decide to claim Social Security. And surprisingly, a lot of people claim it as soon as they become eligible. Roughly a quarter of new retirees start collecting benefits at 62, the earliest possible age. By age 66, about half have already filed. The problem is that those early payments come with a permanent reduction in your monthly benefit. Here's a simple example using round numbers. Imagine your full retirement benefit is $1,000 per month. If you claim at 62, you might receive around $700 a month instead. But if you wait until age 70, that same benefit could grow to roughly $1,240 per month. That's an extra $540 every month. Not for a few years, for the rest of your life. That's why dividend investing and Social Security timing aren't really two separate decisions. They're two pieces of the same retirement strategy. If your dividend portfolio, Even a relatively modest one can help cover your expenses during those years before you claim Social Security. You give yourself something incredibly valuable: options. Instead of taking a smaller benefit because you have no other choice, you can afford to wait. And every year you wait, your future monthly income continues to grow. Unfortunately, many retirees never connect those two decisions. They claim Social Security early because they need the income today, without realizing that a carefully planned dividend portfolio could have helped them delay and lock in a much larger benefit for the rest of their retirement. So far, we've covered how to contribute more, how to avoid paying unnecessary taxes on your dividends, how to access retirement money before age 59 and a half, and how all of that fits together with your Social Security strategy. Now let's talk about where people starting at 50 most often go wrong, because these aren't complicated mistakes. They're the kind that quietly cost people thousands of dollars simply because no one warned them ahead of time. Before we get to your number, let's look at the mistakes that quietly hold a lot of late starters back. None of these are complicated, but each one can cost you real money if you don't catch it early. The first is one we've already talked about, but it's worth repeating because it's probably the most expensive. If you're between 60 and 63, don't assume the enhanced catch-up contribution is added on top of the standard catch-up. It isn't. The larger limit replaces the smaller one. Planning around money you can't actually contribute can leave your retirement projections off by thousands of dollars over just a few years. The second mistake happens when people leave a job at 55 or later. Their first instinct is to roll the entire 401k into an IRA as quickly as possible. Sometimes that's the right decision. But if you might need access to that money before age 59 and a half, moving it too soon could permanently eliminate your ability to use the rule of 55. It's worth slowing down and understanding your options before making that transfer. The third mistake is chasing the highest dividend yield without asking why it's so high. A bigger yield doesn't automatically mean a better investment. Take REITs as an example. According to recent Nareit data, equity REITs were yielding around 3.65%, while mortgage REITs were paying roughly twice that. At first glance, the higher yield looks like the obvious winner, but that extra income comes with significantly more leverage and much greater sensitivity to interest rates. In other words, the yield is higher because the risk is higher. A dividend portfolio shouldn't be built around whichever investment happens to pay the biggest distribution today. It should be built around income you can reasonably expect to keep receiving for years to come. The fourth mistake doesn't affect everyone today, but it can affect more people than you might expect in the future. Once your income reaches certain levels, the IRS adds an additional 3.8% surtax on net investment income, including dividends. For 2026, that generally applies once income exceeds $200,000 for single filers or $250,000 for married couples filing jointly. What's interesting is that those thresholds haven't been adjusted for inflation since the tax was introduced. So the more successful your investment plan becomes, the easier it is to cross those limits without ever realizing you're getting close. None of these are reasons to delay investing. If anything, they're reasons to learn the rules now instead of discovering them a few years later, when a tax return or an expensive mistake forces you to. Now, let's get to the number you actually came here for. Let's run through 3 realistic scenarios, not the kind of examples that assume you've somehow saved $500,000 already, the kind that actually reflect where many people find themselves when they are starting at 50. We'll look at someone beginning with $50,000, another with $150,000, and a third with $300,000. In each case, we'll assume they're contributing $400 per month, earning an average annual total return of 7%, and building toward a portfolio that eventually produces about a 4% dividend yield. That's a reasonable middle ground, higher than the average yield of the dividend aristocrats, which has recently been around 2.8%, but lower than many higher yield REIT portfolios we talked about earlier. So what do those numbers actually look like? Let's start with $50,000. After 15 years of compounding taking you from age 50 to 65, that portfolio grows to roughly $258,000. At a 4% yield, that's about $860 per month in dividend income without selling a single share. Now let's increase the starting balance to $150,000. Under those same assumptions, the portfolio grows to around $534,000 over 15 years. That translates to roughly $1,780 per month in dividend income. And finally, let's look at someone starting with $300,000. After the same 15-year period, the portfolio reaches approximately $948,000. At a 4% yield, that's about $3,160 per month in dividend income. Notice something important. None of these examples required extraordinary investment returns. None assumed perfect market timing, and none depended on finding the next superstar stock. They simply combined consistent contributions, long-term compounding, and a realistic dividend yield. Which brings us to your number. The formula is actually straightforward. Start with your current portfolio balance. Add whatever you can realistically contribute each month, including any catch-up contributions you're eligible to make. Project that forward using a conservative long-term growth rate. Then multiply the final portfolio value by the dividend yield you expect to generate. That's your number, not Paul's, not mine, yours. And if you'd rather not build that calculation yourself, I've linked a free dividend snowball calculator in the description. It uses this exact formula and lets you plug in your own numbers in just a few seconds. If you want something more detailed, with automatic catch-up contribution calculations, income projections, and portfolio tracking, that's exactly what the Dividend Income Toolkit was built to do. Before we wrap up, let's quickly recap the 4 biggest takeaways. First, the catch-up stack. Once you turn 50, you can contribute $9,100 more each year to tax-advantaged retirement accounts than someone under 50. And if you're between 60 and 63, that extra contribution increases to $12,350. Just remember one important detail. The larger catch-up doesn't stack on top of the regular one, it replaces it. Second, the 61-day tripwire. Whether your dividends receive the lower qualified tax rate or get taxed as ordinary income often comes down to one thing: holding your investments long enough. If you're building a long-term dividend portfolio instead of trying to trade around dividend dates, this rule usually takes care of itself. Third, the rule of 55 bridge. If you leave your employer in or after the year you turn 55, you may be able to access that employer's retirement plan without paying the usual 10% early withdrawal penalty, but only if the money stays in that plan. Roll it into an IRA too soon, and that opportunity disappears. And finally, forget comparing your retirement plan to someone else's spreadsheet. The only number that really matters is yours. Your starting balance, your monthly contribution, your timeline. Run those numbers using realistic assumptions and you'll have a far better picture of what's actually possible. Let's go back to Paul for a moment. When he walked out of that meeting, he still had 14 years until retirement. That hadn't changed, but something else had. He finally stopped making decisions based on assumptions and started making them based on the real numbers. And once he understood the rules that were already available to someone his age, retirement stopped looking like a closing door. It started looking like something he could still build toward. That's the point of this entire video. You're not too late. You don't need perfect timing. You don't need to make up for 20 years overnight. You just need to understand the rules. Use the advantages that are available to you today and let the math work from where you are, not from where you wish you had started. If you're wondering which investments fit into a strategy like this, watch my next video, where I break down the best dividend ETFs to live off in America and explain how they can work together in a long-term income portfolio. And before you go, I'd love to hear from you. How old are you? What's your starting balance? And how much are you investing each month? Leave your numbers in the comments. I read every one of them, and I'm always curious to see what everyone's dividend journey looks like.